Greetings, I'm Blackjack Fitz, and what you are looking at on screen is my newest puzzle, A New Secret. If you'd like to give this puzzle a shot, it will be linked in the video description below. What I'm going to be doing in this video is reading through the rules, making sure that those are clear to anybody who would like to try the puzzle. And then I'll be going through the solve path in case you get stuck and would like to see how the intended logic is meant to solve this puzzle. So, first, place the digits 0 through 8 once in every row, column, and box of the grid. So unlike traditional Sudoku, where you'd have the digits 1 through 9 in every box, row, and column, here we would be replacing the 9 with a 0 for reasons that will be clear shortly. The cell with the gray circle is odd, and the cell with the gray square is even. So this cell is either 1, 3, 5, or 7. And this could be 2, 4, 6, or 8. A 0 is neither even nor odd, so neither of these cells can be 0. Shade some cells in the grid such that all instances of the shaded cells and all instances of the unshaded cells are orthogonally connected. No 2x2 area can be completely shaded or unshaded. So this is classic Yin Yang logic. Traditionally, we'll use gray for shaded and green for unshaded. So what that means is you need to take something. It's always difficult to make this work. See if we can do something like that. No, not that one. Something like that might work for shaded, and then the rest of it could be unshaded. And you can see that we've got two areas. Oh no, then we got a 2x2 here, so it's not quite right. But all of this would then be unshaded. And assuming there wasn't any areas like this, which were 2x2, you could have, and down here, well, it's difficult to get that on the first try. But something like this, where you can essentially connect all of them together into two blocks. If you can avoid these 2x2s, then you'll end up with a grid that meets the rules of the yin-yang logic. Shaded cells count as negative for box sums and cage totals. So let's say we knew those were all shaded and that one, and these were unshaded cells in that box. Now, what we would be doing is saying all of these are going to count as negative. A 0 can't be negative and is never shaded. So the 0 would have to exist somewhere in here. A box sum is the sum of all the digits within a box. All box sums are 0. So what that's telling you is that the sum of the digits in the unshaded and the sum of the digits in the shaded cells are going to equal out. Also, digits within a cage sum to the clue in the top left corner of the cage. And that's why you can get cages like this, which is 0, and also -5. And that's because of the shading rule. So let's take a look at what that means in practice. Because there is a secret to a traditional Sudoku puzzle, which is that every box, every row, and every column in a normal puzzle would sum to 45. And that's because the digits 1 through 9, if you add them all up, equals 45. And that is a secret that was told to me by a good friend who only tells that secret to his close friends. But of course, I belong to that coterie of individuals. And so I'm sharing that with you now. But in this puzzle, we have a new secret, and this is where the title comes from, which is that the absolute value of all of the digits in any row, any column, or box would equal 36. And that's because the sum of the digits 0 through 8, absolute value, is 36. So all of the digits in here, when we did it, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. If you added all those up, you would get 36. But what the rules are saying is that we need to find a way to take 18 of those cells and shade them and leave the other remaining 18 some and unshade them. So here you can see 7 plus 8 plus 3 is 18. And then 0, 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6 also equals 18. So this would be a correct way to meet the box sums requirement. But of course, we've got a 2 by 2 of unshaded cells. So this would not be a correct way to fill in this group. And that is essentially all of the rules and how to play the puzzle. If you are new to Yin Yang puzzles, there are a few things that are going to be helpful in trying to solve this puzzle. The first is that if you know that these two cells are shaded and this cell is unshaded by whatever logic, in fact, this is wrong because of the 10 cage, but if you knew that for whatever reason, this pattern existed in the grid, you could immediately shade this cell. Actually, I chose a poor place to locate that. Let's do it here. 2 shades and an unshade. This we know must be shaded. And the reason is because if you tried to leave it unshaded, in connecting these two unshaded cells, no matter how you did it, you would prevent this cell from ever getting to that without crossing over it, forming a bridge that crosses through. You've been essentially locked out. There's no way for this to get out. So you can never have this pattern, this checkerboard pattern. And the corollary of that has to do with the border of the grid, which is that let's say we know that those are unshaded, or those are unshaded, and that was shaded. Well, we could immediately take and fill in all of these digits as unshaded. And the reason is because if you imagine trying to put a shaded cell here, no matter how you connected these clues together, you would be separating the shaded cells up at the top of the grid. You could never get them over to the unshaded cells at the bottom of the grid. You've created a wall, an impenetrable wall that prevents the unshaded cells from reaching each other. So what that means is that there can only be 2 strips of shading along the perimeter. And since we've already got our shaded cell over there, we would know that those all had to be unshaded. And then we would, this, for example, if that was shaded, we would know immediately that all of those had to be shaded as well by the same logic. So those are a couple of classic yin yang tricks that are going to come in handy as we solve this puzzle. So if you haven't given it a shot, please feel free to click the link in the video description. I'd love for you to give the puzzle a shot and leave me any feedback or questions or concerns along the way. But at this point, I'm going to go ahead and explain the logic, the solve path for the puzzle. So if you don't want to watch that before giving it a shot, go ahead and pause the video now and try the puzzle yourself. Okay, so what I was hoping to do with this puzzle is actually to give a very sparse grid, and I think I've accomplished that. The reason is because I want you to immediately start thinking about meta type clues, right? Rather than going, well, what are all the different ways you could fill in, a 3 clue or a 2 clue? In a normal puzzle, you actually can't even make a 2 clue like this with 2 cells because they can't both be 1. However, in this puzzle, there's actually lots of ways. It could be a 8. It could be an 8 and a 6, or it could be a 7 and a 5, or it could be a 6 and a 4, or it could be a 5 and a 3, or a 2 and a 0. All the different ways of filling in that cell. So there's lots of different ways. And in fact, for all of these, you're going to have a ton of variation, except for the 0 clue. That one's a freebie. So you can put in the 0, and since zeros can never be shaded, you can actually get a little bit right off the bat. But that doesn't take you very far. what you actually need to look at first are these 10 clues, and this one in particular, because the positive 10 clue tells you that both of those digits must be positive. And that's because you can't put an 11 and a -1 in. So both of those are positive, and similarly, both of those are negative, which means that they're shaded. But this positive one is actually the most important place to start, because imagine if both of those were positive, we would be creating a 2 by 2 here. So these can't both be positive. Now, one of them can be positive, but at least one of these must be shaded, and that's really important. So we don't know which one of those, but there must be a shaded cell up here. And now, the next realization that you have to do to solve this puzzle, this is the break-in essentially, is to ask whether this can ever be shaded, right? I think because we know that there has to be a 0 up here, they can't both be shaded, right? Because one side of this is going to break with a 0, and that 0 has to be unshaded. And obviously there has to be a 0 on both sides of the in column 1 and in column 9. So all of these are immediately unshaded. But we can even do better than that, because we can ask, can we ever get to even here as shaded? And the answer is actually no. And the reason it's no is because if you imagine this was shaded and we had to connect all of these now together to make them shaded. We'll get rid of that unshading, okay? So if we imagine all of these are shaded, then we know that this is a 2 by 2 box. So at least one of these also would have to be shaded. But the first thing we have to think about is, well, how many shaded cells can actually exist in a single box? And the answer to that is only 5. You can put a 1, forgive me, a 1, 2, 3, 4, and 8, for example. But you could never put a 5 and a 6, right? That's too many. So to get to 6, the way to think about this is, what's the triangular number for 6, right? What's 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6? That's 21, which is too much. And you can never use the 0. It can't be shaded. So you can only ever get to 5 cells, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 8 is one way. There's a number of ways to do it. But 1, 2, 3, 4, and 8 is one example, but you can never get to 6. Now that's not true for unshaded cells, because you can do, for example, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 8. So you could make all of these unshaded, but you could never make them all shaded. And that's because of the rule that zeros can't be shaded. So the maximum number of shaded cells is 5. So if you look back at the corner up here, if we went and tried to wrap all the way around the perimeter of the grid, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, to get out and over here, we would break this box because we've used all of the shaded cells and we still have a 2 by 2 left in the corner. So what we can actually say right off the bat, let me delete a lot of this stuff here, is that the farthest this can reach is here, and the same is true over there. Those are the farthest, and it can't go that far on both sides because there has to be a 0 in the top row. But at a maximum, those are as far as the gray cells can reach now. So we know actually that all of these cells must be unshaded. And that is going to open up the doors to all kinds of things. Beginning with these clues in the bottom in box 7 and 9. And that's because these cells now, because of the 2 by 2 rule, have to be shaded. But that's a negative number and a positive cage on both sides. So we know that both of these have to be positive numbers to overcome however negative the shaded cells are. The other thing to appreciate is that there has to be at least 3 shaded cells in every box, right? And at least 4 unshaded cells in every box. So we can immediately fill in these little strips as shaded as well in order to reach the minimum number of shaded cells in the box. Now we can think about, what are the ways of making 18 using only 3 Sudoku digits from 0 through 8? And the answer is with a 378, a 468, or a 567. So the two lowest numbers that we can add here would be 3 and 4, right? And the other option would be 5, which in theory that could be a 5, but this one can't. So that's a 3 or a 4. And we're going to end up with lots of 6, 7s, and 8s in here, right? So 5, 6, and 7, or 6, 7, and 8. But what that's going to do here is it's going to create a quadruple. So these can be from 6, 7, or 8 only, if we assume that the lowest digit is going to have to go in the cage. So let's go ahead and put those in. We'll do 6, 7, and 8. But now this is going to be put a lot of pressure on what these digits can be up here. In particular, at least one of them is going to have to be a 5. And so if you think about actually how that works, the only place it works is in the 2 cage with a 3. So that has to be the 5. That has to be the 3. And now that is going to be a 7, 8. Now, this could be 5, 6, 7 with an 8. But what that would do, let's take a look at what that would do here. So 5 with an 8, that works. And then this becomes a 6, 7. Oops. 8. So what that does, however, is it duplicates too many digits in these rows. So it creates 2 5s, 2 8s, and 2 7s. And then if you think about how many 5s, 7s, and 8s you can have in these 2 rows, the answer is 2. So in the middle box, neither of these could be 5, 7, or 8, which means that this would have to be a 5, 7, 8 triple, but the given 1 actually prevents that from happening here. So we know that that's not a 5, that's a 4 with a 7. That 7 gives us the 8 and the 7 over here. The 4 has to go with a 6, 8, not a 6, 7. Now that has to be the 8, and that has to be the 6. And now we just have repeated 7s and 8s, which go down here. So only 2 repeated digits is how we figure that one out. Now, what we know already is we've got 15, 16 total positive digits in box 8. And that's going to give us our next clue to what we do, because we can ask whether both of those could be shaded cells. And the answer is obviously no, or we create a 2 by 2. So there has to be at least one unshaded cell here, and there has to be at least one unshaded cell here for the exact same reason. But what that does is that creates 5 shaded cells when we already have 16 total. So that's going to max us out. There's going to be one unshaded cell here and one unshaded cell here. So we know for sure that that's going to be shaded. And this is going to have to be a 2, 0. So now we know the composition of the unshaded cells. It's 0, 1, 2, 7, 8, which means that we know the composition of the shaded cells, which is going to be 3, 4, 5, and 6. So this one can't be 3 or 4, so that's going to be a 5 or 6. And this one can't be 5 or 6, so that's going to be 3 or 4. Now, if we think about the distribution of the other shaded cells, we know that they're going to end up catty corner, because one of them has to be the other 3 or 4, and one of them has to be the other 5 or 6. So we can't, for example, do this, because there would be nowhere for the other 3 or 4 to go. So we're going to end up in one of these two positions. Now, the beautiful thing about that is it actually doesn't matter what happens here, but I need to actually return to these cells here, because in order for that logic to make sense, we have to notice that we can't make a 2 by 2 here. So these have to become shaded, and we can't do, we can't have checkerboard patterns. So that has to be shaded, and that has to be shaded by symmetry. Now, when we think about these two cells being catty corner, it doesn't matter how we do it. We'll just set it up this way first. And this would be the unshaded cells. Now, this one has to be unshaded in order to prevent a 2 by 2. And this one has to be unshaded because this cell has to get out. And that's true no matter what orientation you have for these. So right now it's shaded in the top left. If we do shaded in the top right, it's the exact same thing. You just flip the reasoning. Now this one has to get out, and this one has to prevent the 2 by 2. So we don't actually know what these shadings are, but it doesn't matter because both of these end up having to be unshaded anyway. And let's go ahead and fill this in because I think there's something else very interesting that's happening here, which is that these cells still need to get out, which both on both sides. So in fact, both of these now become unshaded, and that's independent of what's going on down here. So now we've got this situation, and we know that we need to get to 3 unshaded cells. Well, can this center ever be, or sorry, 3 shaded cells? We know that the center can't be shaded because if you do that, no matter which one you take for your third, you're going to end up with a checkerboard pattern. So in fact, that one can never be shaded. It must be unshaded, and this must be shaded. And so we get that pattern coming out. All right, now we know that these are positive numbers and negative cages, so we have the same effect that we had down here. We know these must be shaded cells now, and we know in order to avoid a 2 by 2, we get unshaded cells. Avoid a 2 by 2, we get shaded cells. Now avoid a checkerboard, so we get shaded cells here. And remember, these digits still, no matter how we lock this up, need to get out. So that actually has to become unshaded. Avoided 2 by 2, we get shading. Avoided 2 by 2, we get unshaded. Avoided checkerboard, we get shaded. And we end up in this situation just from different shading logic, which I think is one of the more fun parts of this puzzle. But we can do a little bit better here. For example, we can fill in using arithmetic, we can actually start to get some numbers in the grid. So this is either a 6 or a 7. Now, if we think about this digit, how high can it go? Well, it can't be 8 or 7. So the highest that digit can be is a 6, and there's no 0 left in this box. So the lowest that can be is 1. So that actually forces itself just based on the highest you can go in the shaded and the lowest you can go in the unshaded. And you can do the same thing over here now that you've done the left-hand side, which is that the highest that can go is a 7 and the lowest that can go is a 2. So we fill that in, and something really fun happens here. If you think about what are the compositions of 5 shaded cells with a 7, there's only one way to do it. You actually end up getting a 1, 2, 3, and 5 to make 18, and you get a 0, 4, 6, 8 on the other side. And for the 6, very similarly, you get 1, 2, 3, 5. No, 1, 2, 4, 5, excuse me. So the 3 and the 4 differ from to make up for the difference between the 6 and the 7. And you get the same kind of thing over here where you get 0, 3, 7, 8 as the numbers. Now, what's really interesting here is first of all, that can't be a 2 because of the gray circle. But what we know is that in these digits, we have a 1, a 2, and a 5. And over here, we have a 1, a 2, and a 5. And again, we can ask how many 1s and 2s and 5s do you expect in these rows? And the answer is 2, or 1 each in each row, right? So those have been fully allocated. So now we have to ask, well, where does the 1, 2, and 5 go in the middle box? And it has to go here, which gives us a 5 in the very middle of the grid, gives us a 6, 7, and 3. Now, that 7 tells us that the composition of this 0, 1, 2, 5 is 4, 6. So we can go ahead and pencil mark that in. And that gives us a 3, 8 at the top of the grid. That 4, 6 rules 4 out of here. And it rules, the 3, 8 rules a 3 out of here. Now we know that this top row needs a 7. It can only go here. So we'll put that in. And we know that this needs a 6, and it can only go here. So we can put that in, and let's get rid of our 6s here, get rid of 7s. Now we can actually do better than that, because this cell can't be a 4 because of that 4, and this cell can't be a 4 because of the 4-6 pair here. So that becomes the 4. That's not a 4. And that's not a 4. And we can do the exact same thing. The 3 looks here, and the 3 that must go in this cage exists down there. So that's not a 3, which means, forgive me, this isn't 3, that's not 3, which means that that is the 3 in row 1, column 5. And we're left with this 0, 8 grouping here. Okay, so pretty good shape here. I want to go back to doing some coloring, which is to ask if that can ever exist. And I think with just a little bit of look ahead, you can see that it can't, because that now has to be green. And then that cell has to be gray to avoid a 2x2, and it has to be green to avoid a checkerboard. So that cell can never be gray, is what we've learned there. So that has to be green. And we can ask whether that can be green, and the answer is no, because if those are all green, we only have 2 gray cells in the box. So that's got to be gray, which means that this one has to be gray. We don't know anything about that, but we've got at least 1 gray up there, so we're good. Now, can this be gray? I think. Well, can this be green? I think is actually the important question here. If that's green, what do you put there? Gray, and you make a checkerboard. So again, no, that one has to be gray. And we're left unknowing for those situations. But we can actually do a little bit better over on the left-hand side, because we have to appreciate the fact that somewhere in row 1, we need a 0. And I want to ask first whether this can ever be a 0. And if we imagine that it is a 0, what we'll quickly find is that the allocation of digits around box 4, 6, 7, and 9 prevent that from happening. So if that's 0, that has to be 0, which means that that has to be 0. Now that 0 rules 0 out of there, so we get a 0 up here, which makes that 0, and the column or row 5 breaks. We get 2 zeros in that row. And the exact same thing happens if we make that a 0. That becomes 0, that becomes 0. Now the 0 gets shoved over into column 9, which makes that a 0. And again, row 5 breaks. So the 0 in the top row can't exist in one of the corners. It also can't exist here, which means that at a minimum, the 0 goes to there, right? If we're thinking about how far this can stretch, it must go at least that far, because the 0 is either there, there, or there. And if it's there, we get all of these. If it's there, we get all of those. But it goes at least that far. So now we get all of those as unshaded. We get to avoid a 2x2 here. And the next question is, can all of these be shaded? And the answer is no, of course, because we would end up with all kinds of different 2x2s. In that situation, or 2 of them, I guess. So only 3 of these can be shaded, and it can't be these 3, because we would end up with a 2x2 here. So that one must be shaded, and then we're going to get one of these 2 that's shaded. But if we think back again at how the composition of a 3-cell shaded box works, we know that it has to have 2 digits from 6, 7, or 8. So it can be 3, 7, 8, 4, 6, 8, or 5, 6, 7. So this has to be that lower digit, but that means that this can never be shaded, because we have a 6, 7, 8 here already, and we need 2 digits that are from 6, 7, or 8. So that's not a shaded cell. That's unshaded. That makes that shaded. That also makes this a 3, 4, or 5. Although if we look here carefully, that 5 rules 5 out of here, which means that there's a 5 here. So now we know that that is a 3 or a 4, and that these are from 6, 7, and 8, and they definitely include an 8, which makes this 0, this 8, over here is 0, that one's 8. Now we get a 0 pencil marked there, and a 0 pencil marked there. Okie dokie. So this unshaded cell now needs to get out. That goes to here. I have to avoid a 2 by 2, so that becomes shaded. And now we can do a little bit of thinking around box 2 here. So box 2, we know that these 3 digits by Sudoku have to be a 2, 4, and 8. And very interestingly, that causes a lot of problems for this 10 cage, because if that was 2, that would have to be the 8. And then this doesn't work because the 8 we know is in this row. And it works exactly the same thing here. If this is the 8, we would need this to be a 2, but simultaneously we know that this is a 2-4 pair. So that actually must be a 4, which makes this a 6, excuse me, makes this a 6. And we can rule 4 out of these two. We can rule 4 out of this, which makes it a 3. So now we know those are 6. Had the wrong button click there. So we know that's a 7-8 pair now. Okie dokie. So what we know, this is interesting because let's think about these two cells. If these two cells, they can't be opposite, because if they're opposite, it has to be green there and gray there, which creates a checkerboard pattern. And it can't obviously be the other way around, because if that was green and that was gray, we would have broken our rules about only having 2 different kinds of shadings along the perimeter. So this is either both green or it's both gray. And you can actually see very quickly that it has to be both gray, because if it was both green, now we know that we've got these 2 digits which sum to 10 and these 2 digits which sum to 10. That's 20, which is already too much for the 18, and we still have 2 more green digits to go. So those 2 digits must be gray. And we can start to think about, well, where does the 0 go then in the unshaded cells in this box? And it must go there, which means that that has to be 8 in order for the mathematics to work to get us to 18. So now that is a 2. And we've gotten quite a bit done there. So what do we do? Now that 8 gives us a 7 over here and an 8 over here. The 6 gives us a 4 here and a 6 here. And we know that we need a 4 in this box, and Sudoku tells us that it's there, which means that that's the 5, and both of those are shaded. And we have a 0 and a 2 to place, so now that becomes the 0, and that becomes the 2, and both of those become unshaded. And do we have these yet? I don't think we do. All right, but we did get most of our shading done at this point, which is lovely. Now by Sudoku, we can actually rule 8 out of all of these, plus these 2, rule it out of those, and that gives us an 8 up here. We also know that there's a 7 over here, and one of those two, actually it goes exactly here, because we have the existing 7 already. Now we can ask, well, before we start asking things, let's do some more Sudoku down at the bottom of the grid. So that becomes 0, that makes this a 1. Now we have a 1 and a 2 to place, so that becomes the 1 and that becomes the 2. All right, that makes we have 3 and 5 down in that column. Now I want to ask whether this can be unshaded, because if that's unshaded, we would be hitting 8, 7, and a minimum of 3 here, which is already our 18, and we know that we have 2 more cells at least to pick up. So that tells us for certain that that must be shaded. Now, we know that one of these at least must be shaded, because if they were both unshaded, we would get all kinds of 2x2s. But also, we know that one of them must be unshaded, because if we made them both shaded, we've actually locked out this portion of our unshaded cells. So this is actually going to be a combo, shaded and unshaded. Don't yet know exactly what way, but we will shortly once we get a bit more Sudoku done here. So where do we look for Sudoku at this point? Well, we can ask what these digits are, which is 1, 3, 5, and 7. Now, that's not 7, that's not 7, that's not 5 or 5. And alrighty. This one is going to be a 2, 4, or 6, right? And I think we actually need to do all kinds of stuff here. We got 0, 1, 2, 4, 6. Is that right? And 5? And 5? Okay, so now none of these can be 0 or 1. And this one can't be 4 or 6. That's 2 or 5. This can't be 6 or 6. What am I missing here? That's not 0. So where is the 0? It's got to go here. Okay, that's good. Being very slow with my Sudoku today. 1, 2, 4, and 5. Well, we know actually the 5's here, so that's not 5. That's not 5. That's not 1 either. This is a 2, 4, 6. Okay. This is 0, 3, and 5. Very good. Well, actually, where's the 1 go now in this column? It's got to go in these two, which means that this needs to be a 1, which we could have actually seen just by looking at the pencil marks here. But that makes this a 3. This can't be 3, 3, or 3. That can't be, yeah, that's a, oh, these can't be 1s. I'm only now saying from this. So that makes this a 5, this is 7, that's our 1. This makes that a 2. So now we don't have 2 here or here or here. 4, 5, or 6. That's not 2. 4 or 6. So there's a 5 up here, definitely. Good. Okay. That 3 tells me that this is a 5, and that's 3 in the corner. There it is, down there, hanging out in the spotlight. All right, so we've got 0, 5. This is going to be a 0, 1 pair up here. Memory serves. Now, we can ask whether this, at this point, we can ask whether that's the unshaded cell. And what it would do if it was, is we could actually tell you for sure what that is, because 5 and 7 is 12, plus 5, 7, and 1 is 13. So that digit would have to be a 5, which already exists in the box. So indeed, that's not unshaded, that is shaded, and that's the unshaded. That being shaded tells us that it's a 1. That makes that the 0, makes this the 0. That one's 5. That 5 rules 5 out of these cells. The 1's out of here. Okay. Now, how does this work? We've got 9 already, so we need another 9 here. And we have, what numbers are we missing? 3, and there must be a 3. So it's got to be a 3, 6, right? So that has to be 3, 6, which gives us a 4 and a 5 and a 6. 3, 6, do we know? Yes, the 6 tells us that's a 3, that's a 6. These have to be 2 and 4. Is that right? 12 and 6. That's correct. So 2 and 4. The 4 gives it to us. 4 and 2, 5. We should know that as a 3 now. 1, 2. This 3 we should get from the 8, 7, 8, 3. Now this isn't 2, it's 1 and 4. And that 1 tells us, so that's the 4, that's a 1, that's a 2, and that's a 5. Now this is a 2, that's a 4, and if we haven't made any mistakes, that is the puzzle. My own puzzle, and it takes still quite a bit of time to solve. It is a difficult one, but I think there's some beautiful logic in it. If you've made it this far, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the puzzle yourself, and I would love to hear your feedback on it.